They say every woman has a breaking point. Mine came on a Wednesday night in the middle of winter, 72 hours after I'd been cut open on an operating table to bring 2 lives into this world. I was lying in a private maternity suite on the 14th floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive hospitals. My body still stitched together, my arms still learning the weight of 2 newborn boys, when the door opened and my mother-in-law walked in wearing a coat that cost more than my first car. She wasn't alone. Behind her came my husband, and beside my husband, holding his hand with the casual confidence of a woman who had already decided she'd won, was a 25-year-old social media influencer named Cassandra Voss. Cassie, as everyone called her. Cassie, who was wearing a cream-colored blouse that draped loosely over a stomach that was just beginning to show. I looked at the 3 of them standing in the doorway of my hospital room, and something very quiet happened inside me. Not a breakdown, not a wave of grief. Something more like a thermostat clicking off, a system shutting down the unnecessary functions and rerouting all available power to the parts that actually mattered. My name is Margot Powell. I am 34 years old. I am a corporate actuary, which means I spend my professional life calculating the precise mathematical probability of catastrophic events and designing strategies to survive them. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The maternity suite smelled like antiseptic and the ghost of the flower arrangement my colleague Dana had sent 2 days ago. The blooms were already starting to turn at the edges. I'd been watching them fade the way you watch small things when you have nothing else to do but lie still and wait for your body to remember how to work again. My boys were sleeping in the bassinet beside my bed. Both of them, tucked side by side like 2 small facts I couldn't argue with. Identical in the way that only newborns can be. Red-faced, fist-clenched, utterly unaware that the world they'd arrived in was already complicated. I heard Jennifer Powell before I saw her. The particular click of her heels on polished hospital floor was something I'd learned to identify in my first year of marriage the way you learn to identify a particular bird call. Not because you find it beautiful, but because it tells you something important is about to happen. She was 61 years old, Jennifer Powell. She had the posture of a woman who had never once doubted that a room belonged to her the moment she entered it. Her coat was charcoal cashmere, her bag was Italian leather, and her perfume arrived approximately 4 seconds before the rest of her. She did not knock. She pushed the door open with the same energy she brought to every interaction. The energy of someone who had long ago decided that social niceties were for people who needed something from her, and she had never needed anything from anyone. Ethan came in behind her. My husband. 34 years old, 10 days away from his 35th birthday, with the jaw of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was exceptional, and the eyes of someone who was beginning to privately suspect that wasn't true. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, and he was looking at his shoes with the focused intensity of a man trying to disappear inside himself. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked directly at me in 6 months. Cassie came in last. She was 25, which I knew because I had reviewed her public social media presence with the same professional detachment I brought to actuarial tables. She had 340,000 Instagram followers, a lifestyle brand built around what she called elevated living, and the particular kind of beauty that photographs well and reads as effortless even when it isn't. She was wearing a cream blouse that fell loosely over a stomach that had not been loose 4 months ago. She positioned herself near the window and took out her phone. Jennifer stood at the foot of my hospital bed, and for a moment she simply looked at me. The way you look at a problem you've decided to solve. Then she reached into her leather bag and placed a sealed envelope on my blanket. "I'm not here to argue, Margot," she said. Her voice was the temperature of January river water. "I'm here to settle this efficiently. Inside that envelope is a certified bank draft for $18 million and a set of legal documents. You will sign the divorce filing, you will relinquish your parental rights, and you will be out of the state by the end of the week." She paused. "The boys will be raised appropriately. They will have every advantage. You have my word on that." I looked at the envelope. I looked at Ethan, who was still studying the floor. I looked at Cassie, who was scrolling through something on her phone with an expression of serene detachment, as if she were waiting for a table at a restaurant, and this whole scene was mildly inconvenient. Then I picked up the envelope. I opened it slowly. The bank draft was real. $18 million made out in my name, drawn from a private wealth management account. The legal documents were thick, being maybe 40 pages, printed on heavy stock and organized with tabs. Whoever had prepared them had done thorough work. The language was designed to intimidate by volume rather than complexity, which told me Jennifer's lawyers understood their audience was usually not someone who read contracts for pleasure. I was. I set the bank draft aside and began reading, not performing the act of reading, actually reading, running my eyes down each clause, each paragraph, each carefully constructed sentence designed to make me feel like the terms were inevitable, and the only remaining question was how quickly I would accept them. Jennifer waited. She was good at waiting in the way that powerful people are, not patiently, but with the contained energy of someone who is absolutely certain the wait will be brief. "Jennifer," I said without looking up. "Yes." "Why 18 million? A small pause. It's a generous offer. It's a specific number. I turned a page. You could have offered 15, you could have rounded to 20, but 18 million is a very particular figure. I looked up then and I held her gaze. 3 weeks before I went into labor, I was reviewing Powell Logistics Asia Pacific's quarterly audit, the last audit I had access to before Ethan revoked my credentials. There was an unreconciled entry in the offshore subsidiary ledger. I set the document down on my lap. Exactly $18 million, unaccounted for. The room changed temperature. Ethan's head came up for the first time since he'd walked in. Cassie stopped scrolling. Jennifer's expression didn't break. I'll give her that. She was 61 years old and she'd been in boardrooms with men who'd spent their careers trying to rattle her. A 34-year-old woman in a hospital bed wasn't going to accomplish what they hadn't. But something shifted behind her eyes. A recalibration. "You're exhausted," she said. "You've just given birth. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm an actuary," I said. "I think most clearly when everything is at stake." And she looked at me for another 3 seconds. Then, in a move I had not anticipated, she smiled. "Then you understand the math," she said. $18 million. Sign the papers tonight and you never have to think about any of this again. Fight me and you spend the next decade of your life in litigation funded by resources you cannot match. She tilted her head slightly. "I've been doing this longer than you've been practicing your profession, Margot. I know how these things end." I looked down at the bank draft in my hands. $18 million. It was, by any measure, a staggering amount of money. More than I would earn in 2 decades at my current billing rate. Enough to buy a house in cash, educate 2 children through graduate school, fund a comfortable retirement, and still have enough left over to be genuinely free for the first time in my adult life. It was also, I was almost certain, stolen. "I have one condition," I said. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "I don't accept paper instruments, not for a transaction this size." I kept my voice completely level, the way I kept it level when I was presenting catastrophic risk projections to clients who didn't want to hear the numbers. A certified bank draft from a corporate account requires clearing time. Given the current state of the Powell Logistics offshore subsidiary, the one with the $18 million discrepancy, there's a non-trivial probability that a withdrawal of this magnitude could be flagged by your board before the funds clear, or you could place a stop payment order the moment you leave this room. I folded the bank draft carefully and set it on the blanket beside me. "If you want my signature tonight, you'll authorize a wire transfer directly to my personal account, immediate and irrevocable." Cassie looked up from her phone for the first time. Ethan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Jennifer studied me for a long moment. I watched her run the calculation, whether I was bluffing, whether this was a negotiating tactic, whether the simplest thing was to simply call my bluff and see what happened. She decided, as I had known she would, that the simplest thing was to win quickly. She took out her phone. She dialed Gerald Simmons, her private wealth manager, and she told him, in clipped, precise sentences, to authorize an immediate wire transfer of $18 million to the account number I read aloud from the banking app on my own phone. Priority routing, tonight. Then she hung up and looked at me with the expression of someone setting down a very heavy and very expensive piece of furniture exactly where they want it. "The documents," she said. I picked up the pen she'd placed on my bedside table. I turned to the signature page, and I signed. Jennifer took the documents, tucked them into her leather bag, and stood up to her full height. "My security team will be here at 6 a.m. to collect the boys," she said. "I'd suggest you use the time to make arrangements." She turned and walked out. Ethan followed without speaking. Cassie paused at the door and offered me something that might have been meant as a sympathetic smile, then thought better of it and left. The door clicked shut. I was alone. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:47 p.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a banking notification. Incoming wire transfer confirmed, $18 million. Funds available immediately. I set the phone down. I looked at my 2 sons sleeping in the bassinet, their small chests rising and falling with the unconscious confidence of people who have not yet learned that the world requires anything from them. Then I picked up my phone again and called Raymond Hartley. Raymond answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake and waiting. He was 40 years old, Raymond Hartley. He had grown up in Maryland, the son of a high school history teacher and a hospital administrator, and he had put himself through law school on loans and evening shifts at a copy center. He had been practicing corporate law for 12 years, and he was, by any honest measure, one of the best attorneys I'd ever encountered, which was saying something, because my profession required me to work closely with lawyers who charge rates that would make most people's vision blur. He was also Diana Powell Hartley's husband, Diana, who was Ethan's older sister. Diana, who had spent the first 8 years of her adult life trying to earn her mother's approval before finally, at 32, accepting that Jennifer Powell's approval was not something that existed in transferable form. Diana, who had quietly relocated to Brooklyn 4 years ago, rebuilt her life at a careful distance from her family and had, 2 years ago when she realized what was happening in my marriage, reached out to me at a work conference with a message that simply read, "I think we need to talk." Raymond was not representing me as a family favor. That distinction mattered, legally and practically. He had filed a formal conflict of interest disclosure with the New York State Bar Association 7 weeks ago, before he'd reviewed a single document on my behalf, disclosing his familial connection to the opposing party and affirming that his client, Margot Powell, had been made fully aware of this relationship and had given informed, written consent to proceed. It was the kind of procedural step that no one outside the legal profession finds interesting, and the kind that protects everything when things go badly. "Wire cleared?" he asked. "Confirmed at 11:49, I said. 18 million, exactly." "And the documents?" "Signed." A brief pause. "Which version did she take?" "The version she brought," I said, with page 2 replaced. I could hear Raymond exhale. Not with relief exactly, but with the particular release of tension that comes when a plan you've been holding in your head for weeks finally makes contact with reality and holds its shape. 6 weeks ago, Raymond and I had prepared 2 versions of a signature page. The cover page and the final signature page, the pages Jennifer would check, were identical in both versions. What changed was page 2, the page bearing the legal title and operative clause of the document. In Jennifer's version, page 2 read, "Parental Rights Relinquishment and Settlement Agreement." In the version now tucked inside Jennifer's leather bag, page 2 read, "Irrevocable Gift Authorization, Powell Children's Educational Trust." The document Jennifer believed was a custody relinquishment was, in legal fact, an irrevocable authorization gifting $18 million to a protected educational trust fund for her grandchildren, a trust in which Margot Powell was named sole managing trustee. It was not a forgery. Both versions had been prepared by Raymond's office. The signature page I had signed was genuine. The document Jennifer had brought to a hospital room at midnight without her own attorney present was the document she had received. The substitution had been made 3 days earlier when Ethan, predictably, given his habit of leaving his briefcase in the front hallway when he came by the hospital, had left the original document package unattended for 11 minutes while he spoke to the attending nurse about visiting hours. 11 minutes is a long time when you know exactly what you're looking for. "She didn't have her lawyer with her," Raymond said. It wasn't a question. "She didn't think she needed one," I said. "She thought she was buying silence from a woman who just had major surgery." Her first mistake tonight," I said. "I'm counting from further back." "Fair." I heard him stand up, the particular sound of someone in a quiet apartment pushing back from a desk. "I'm downstairs. Blue SUV, second spot from the corner. Dr. Annan signed your early discharge authorization this afternoon. Everything's documented and time-stamped. You have a legitimate medical basis for the early release. You're healthy, the boys are healthy, and your own physician cleared you. The night nurse on your floor has the paperwork. When you walk out, you're walking out the front door with nothing to hide." I looked at my boys. "Give me 8 minutes," I said. I pulled the IV needle from the back of my hand, pressed a square of gauze against the small bloom of blood, and held it there for 30 seconds. My abdomen ached with a deep, settled persistence that I had been largely ignoring for 3 days. Not ignoring the way people ignore things they don't notice. Ignoring the way you ignore a fire alarm when you're in the middle of evacuating, aware of it, choosing to deal with it later. I put on the cashmere cardigan Diana had brought me 2 days ago. I put on the soft-soled shoes I'd packed in my hospital bag in the sensible expectation that I would eventually need to walk. I lifted my sons one at a time and settled them into the double infant carrier Diana had brought this afternoon. A practical, well-researched piece of equipment that I had spent considerable time selecting, because I am the kind of person who selects things with considerable time, and because I had known for 4 months that there was a reasonable probability I would need to carry 2 newborns out of a building quickly. I draped my coat over the carrier. I picked up the small bag I'd already packed. I walked to the door. I opened it. The corridor was quiet, lit to the particular dim warmth of hospital nights, smelling of floor cleaner and recycled air. The night nurse at the station at the end of the hall, a woman named Christine who had been kind to me every single shift, looked up when she saw me and nodded once. She had the discharge paperwork ready. She handed me a folder and asked if I needed anything before I left. "I don't think so," I said. "Thank you for everything. And take care of yourself," she said. She looked at the 2 small heads tucked against my chest. "Take care of them." I walked to the elevator. I pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. At 12:34 a.m., I walked through the front entrance of the hospital and into the cold winter air of Manhattan with my 2 sons and 1 bag and $18 million that were, as of that moment, legally mine. Raymond's blue SUV was exactly where he'd said it would be. Raymond pulled into traffic without hurrying. Diana was in the back seat. She took one of the boys from me the moment I was in the car with the automatic ease of someone who has been waiting to do something useful and is relieved to finally be able to do it. Diana was 38. She had her mother's cheekbones and her grandfather's eyes, and she had spent years hating the first fact and making peace with the second. She was a landscape architect. She had a life in Brooklyn that she had built carefully and quietly, the way you build something you know you might have to protect. She didn't speak for the first few blocks. She just held the baby and looked at me in the way that people who love you look at you when they're relieved you're still in one piece. "How are you doing?" she asked finally. "I'm calculating," I said. "That's what I figured." She looked down at the boy in her arms. "He's so small." "They both are," I said. "They'll get bigger." Raymond reached over the console and handed me a sealed envelope without taking his eyes off the road. "When you're ready," he said. I knew what was in it. I'd known for 3 days. Since the afternoon Raymond had come by the hospital, ostensibly to drop off a book Diana had sent, and had slipped this envelope under my pillow with the particular casualness of someone who has thought through every aspect of a situation and is comfortable with how it's going. But I opened it now, in the car, in the dark, because there is a difference between knowing a thing abstractly and seeing it in front of you. I unfolded the paper inside. At the top, in clean block letters, Irrevocable Gift Authorization, Powell Children's Educational Trust. Pursuant to this authorization, the sum of $18 million is hereby designated as an irrevocable gift to the Powell Children's Educational Trust, established for the exclusive benefit of the minor children of Margot Powell. The sole managing trustee of said fund is hereby designated as Margot Powell, with full and exclusive authority over all distributions, investments, and administrative decisions pertaining to said trust. Below that, on the signature line, in my own handwriting, Margot Powell. And below that, on the authorizing party line, because Raymond had prepared this document to require an authorizing signature, and because the cover page Jennifer had checked had shown that line as a formality, and because Jennifer had signed it in the hospital room to acknowledge receipt of the executed agreement. In Jennifer Powell's own signature, in her own pen, Jennifer Powell, I folded the paper and held it in my lap. Outside the window, Manhattan moved past in its usual state, lit and restless and entirely indifferent to whatever particular version of human drama was unfolding inside any given vehicle on any given night. "She signed it," I said. "She signed it," Raymond confirmed. "She authorized the gift irrevocably. Under New York trust law, that transfer cannot be reversed by the donor under any circumstances once the trustee has accepted the funds." He paused. "You accepted the funds at 11:49 p.m. I thought about Jennifer in her charcoal cashmere coat, walking out of my hospital room with the leather bag clutched under her arm and the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just resolved a complicated problem efficiently. I thought about what she would feel when her attorney read page 2. I thought about the 6 months I had spent watching, waiting, calculating, learning the precise shape of her arrogance so I could find the exact point where it became a vulnerability. Jennifer Powell had spent 61 years building an empire on the assumption that people without old money were without resources. That assumption had served her well for a long time. It had led her to walk into a hospital room at midnight without a lawyer. It had led her to hand a corporate actuary a document she hadn't fully read. It had led her to wire $18 million in the middle of the night to a woman she believed she was buying. "Where does the money actually come from?" Diana asked quietly. She was looking at me with an expression that was careful and steady, the expression of someone who wants the full picture because they've committed to whatever that picture contains. I had been thinking about this question for 3 weeks. I had traced the wire transfer routing number backward through the Powell Logistics financial structure as far as my access allowed, which, even with revoked credentials, was farther than Jennifer probably realized, because I had spent 5 years learning the architecture of that company from the inside. "I'm not certain yet," I said, "but the $18 million that was unaccounted for in the Asia Pacific subsidiary, the entry I found 3 weeks before I delivered, it moved. I can see where it went. I can see the routing path." I looked at the document in my lap. "I need more time and better access to confirm where it originated." "How much time?" "Less than a week," I said. "Once she realizes what she signed, she'll accelerate everything. We need to be ready." Raymond nodded. "The apartment is set up. Diana stocked the kitchen this afternoon. You have everything you need for at least 2 weeks." I looked out the window. We were crossing into Brooklyn, the bridge cables strobing overhead in the dark. 6 hours ago, Jennifer Powell had walked into my hospital room believing she was purchasing my silence and my children. She had instead gifted me the legal and financial foundation I needed to dismantle everything she'd spent her life building. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph, in my professional experience, is an emotion you allow yourself after the final numbers are confirmed and the risk has been fully retired. We were not there yet, but I felt something I hadn't felt in 6 months. I felt the clean, settled clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. I looked down at my 2 sons, one in Diana's arms, one tucked against my chest, and made them a promise I didn't say out loud. No one is going to take you anywhere. The math won't allow it. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a battle you've won before the other side knows the fight has started. I lived in that silence for 2 days. Raymond and Diana's apartment in Brooklyn was a 3rd-floor walk-up in Carroll Gardens, the kind of building that had been constructed with the understanding that the people living in it would actually use it. Wide hallways, solid walls, windows that faced a quiet street lined with trees that were bare now in the winter but would be extraordinary in April. Diana had converted the 2nd bedroom into a nursery 6 weeks ago, quietly, without telling me she was doing it, because she is the kind of person who prepares for contingencies without making you feel like a contingency. I set up my laptop on the dining table and I worked. Not frantically, not with the panicked energy of someone running out of time. Methodically, the way I always work. Moving through data the way a doctor moves through a physical exam, checking each system in sequence, looking for the finding that changes the diagnosis. Outside, Manhattan continued its particular version of ordinary life. Jennifer Powell continued hers. For exactly 47 hours, she didn't know what she was holding. On Thursday morning, I made coffee and fed my sons and opened the Powell Logistics Asia Pacific quarterly audit file I had saved to an encrypted drive 6 weeks before my credentials were revoked. I had been careful about this. Careful in the way that people are careful when they know they're looking at something that someone powerful doesn't want them to see. I had not printed anything. I had not forwarded anything. I had simply saved a read-only copy to personal encrypted storage at 11:23 on a Tuesday evening when Ethan was traveling and I was alone in our apartment and something in the numbers had stopped me. The entry I'd found then was still there. $18 million moved through Powell Logistics Asia Pacific LLC, a subsidiary incorporated in the Cayman Islands 4 years ago, in 3 tranches over 11 days, each tranche under the $6 million threshold that would trigger automatic regulatory review. The money had entered from a domestic source and exited to a private wealth management account, an account registered to Jennifer Powell. I had suspected this for 3 weeks. Now I was confirming it. The $18 million Jennifer had wired to me on Wednesday night had not come from her personal assets. It had not come from a savings account or a brokerage portfolio or a trust fund established by her late husband's estate. It had come from Powell Logistics. Specifically, from the Powell Logistics Employee Pension Fund, a protected account holding the retirement contributions of 2,047 employees. most of them middle-income logistics workers who had spent years loading freight and managing warehouses and driving routes in the reasonable expectation that the money deducted from their paychecks every 2 weeks was being held safely for them. Jennifer had moved it to her private account through the offshore subsidiary, almost certainly intending to return it before the next audit cycle. She had done this because her personal liquid assets were temporarily inaccessible, frozen as part of an internal board review of irregular executive transactions that Ethan had accidentally triggered when he'd attempted to transfer a corporate apartment into Cassie's name without board approval. She had taken from the pension fund because it was the one account she still controlled directly, and she had used it to try to buy my children. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I opened a new document and began building the evidence file Raymond would need. On Friday afternoon, Raymond sat across from me at the dining table with a yellow legal pad and the particular focused stillness of an attorney who has just been handed something significant. ERISA violation, he said, without looking up from the routing documentation I'd printed. Federal. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act protects pension funds from exactly this kind of withdrawal. This isn't a civil matter. I know. If we take this to federal prosecutors, Jennifer is looking at criminal exposure. Real exposure. Not corporate fine territory, but personal criminal liability. I know that too. He looked up. So, what do you want to do with it? I had been thinking about this question since Thursday morning when the confirmation had become clear. I want to hold it, I said. For now, it's more useful as leverage than as a criminal referral, at least until we know how the rest of this plays out. But Raymond, I need you to compile the full evidence package. Documented, organized, ready to hand to a U.S. Attorney's office if we need to. That I can do. He made a note. What else? I want to understand the grandfather clause, I said. Completely. Diana mentioned it the night we left the hospital, but I want to go through the original trust document line by line. Raymond reached into his briefcase and produced a bound copy of a document that was old enough that the pages had yellowed slightly at the edges. He'd obtained it 2 months ago through a legitimate discovery request filed in anticipation of the divorce proceedings. A request Jennifer's attorneys had objected to and the court had granted anyway, because the trust was directly relevant to the marital estate. We read it together, and this is where I need to explain something because it's the thing that makes sense of everything Jennifer did. And the thing that most people, watching her behavior from the outside, found inexplicable. The Powell Family Trust had been established by Jennifer's late father-in-law, a man named Gerald Powell Sr., who had built the logistics company from a single freight truck in 1971 and had strong opinions about inheritance, entitlement, and what he called earned continuity. The trust controlled $500 million in company equity. It was designed to pass to his descendants, but Gerald Sr., having watched too many wealthy families dissolve their legacies through succession disputes, had built in a series of conditions. The relevant condition was this: for the male heir, Ethan, the only son, to access his full inheritance, he was required to produce a legitimate biological heir recognized by the Powell Family Council before his 35th birthday. If he failed to do so, controlling interest in the trust defaulted to the company's board of directors, who had the authority to restructure management. The Powell Family Council consisted of 3 members: Jennifer, Diana, and an independent trustee. Jennifer had quietly replaced the independent trustee with a personal associate 14 months ago, a move Diana had been unaware of until Raymond discovered it during the document review. Here was the critical point. The point that the original story in my head had initially gotten wrong until Raymond corrected it. The clause did not simply require Ethan to have a biological child. It required that child to be recognized as a legitimate heir by the family council before the deadline. Jennifer, controlling 2 of the 3 council votes, could refuse to recognize Ethan's sons as legitimate heirs even if their paternity was biologically confirmed, by claiming procedural grounds, documentation failures, or any number of technical objections that a friendly council majority could sustain long enough to let the deadline pass. If she had custody of the boys, she would be their legal representative before the council. She could control what the council recognized. That was why she needed custody. Not the biological fact of the children's existence, but the legal authority to present them or withhold them from the family council's recognition process. So she wasn't trying to steal them because she loves them, Diana said from the kitchen doorway. She had been listening while she made lunch. Her voice was completely flat. She was never trying to steal them because she loves them, I said. Diana was quiet for a moment. I know, she said finally. I've known that about her for a long time. It's different hearing it laid out in legal language. I'm sorry. Don't be. She came to the table and set a plate down in front of me. Eat something. You're nursing 2 babies and running a financial investigation, and you haven't eaten since this morning. I ate. Jennifer's attorney called her at 4:17 on Friday afternoon. I know this because Raymond had a contact in the building where Jennifer's law firm operated, and because attorneys, like most professionals, have colleagues who talk. The specific content of the conversation was privileged. The fact that it occurred, and the fact that Jennifer's car was spotted leaving her building at 4:52 p.m., moving at a pace that suggested she was not going to a dinner reservation, was not. By Friday evening, Jennifer knew what she had signed. I imagined that conversation with her attorney, the moment he turned to page 2 and read the heading aloud. I imagined the particular quality of silence that followed. Jennifer was not a woman who made audible sounds of distress. She would have absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, with stillness, with calculation, with the immediate redirection of energy from the problem to the solution. She would not have screamed. She would have asked one question. What do we do now? The answer, I suspected, would involve a television studio. I was right. Raymond came into the kitchen at 7:15 on Saturday morning carrying his phone and the expression of a man who has bad news he is confident is manageable. They booked Ethan on Andrea Bloom's morning program, he said, airing at 8. Andrea Bloom was the anchor of a nationally broadcast morning financial news program, the kind of show that occupied a specific niche between traditional news and lifestyle programming, watched primarily by people who were already dressed for work and wanted something more substantive than weather and celebrity gossip, but didn't have the appetite for pure financial analysis. She was sharp, experienced, and she had known Jennifer Powell socially for years. I poured a second cup of coffee and turned on the television. Ethan appeared on screen at 8:04. He was wearing a dark navy suit and the careful makeup of someone who had been managed. The slight evening out of his skin tone, the deliberate shadows under his eyes that read as exhaustion rather than artifice. He looked like a worried father. He had been coached to look like a worried father, and whoever had coached him had done competent work. Cassie sat beside him in a pale blue dress, her hand resting on his arm with the studied tenderness of someone performing a feeling rather than having one. Her blouse was slightly more fitted than usual, chosen, I noted, to make visible what was becoming visible anyway. Andrea Bloom leaned forward with her professional compassion expression, the one she reserved for the segment between the market update and the commercial break. Ethan, the country has been following this story. How are you holding up? I'm terrified, Ethan said, and to his credit, the fear in his voice was real, even if its object was not what he claimed it was. Margot has always struggled. I tried to get her help. I never imagined it would come to this. I watched him say words that had been written for him, and I felt nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of information. The person I'd been 5 years ago, sitting across a dinner table from this man and believing she was building something real, felt very far away. Andrea turned to Cassie. You've been described in the press as... I know how I've been described, Cassie said. She had prepared this line. Ethan and I love each other. That's the truth, whatever anyone wants to say about it. She paused, and then she placed her free hand over her stomach, the gesture Jennifer had choreographed, the gesture that was supposed to be the pivot of the whole interview. We wanted to share something today. Despite everything that's happening, despite the pain Margot has brought into our lives, we're expecting a child who will be raised in a stable, loving home. Whatever happens, that's what we're focused on. Andrea's face arranged itself into surprised congratulations. Ethan nodded, his hand covering Cassie's on her stomach, the picture of devoted, expectant fatherhood. I watched all of this from Raymond's dining table with my coffee and my laptop and my 2 sons in the next room making the small, waking sounds of people who were not yet aware that the world had opinions about them. Then I opened my email. Here is what Jennifer didn't know. 3 weeks before I went into labor, Ethan had made a mistake. It wasn't the affair. That mistake was much older. This was a newer, smaller, more specific mistake. He had used the joint credit card, the one connected to our shared household account, the one I still receive statements for, to pay for a consultation at a private reproductive medicine clinic in New Jersey. The charge appeared on the statement as a generic medical billing code. If Ethan had thought about it, he probably assumed I wouldn't know what the code meant. I am an actuary. I know what every medical billing code means. I knew what the clinic specialized in. I knew what consultation services in that billing category typically involved. And when I pulled the clinic's registration documents publicly available through the New Jersey Business Registry, which is exactly as boring and exactly as useful as it sounds, I found that they offered, among other services, non-invasive prenatal paternity testing. Ethan had requested a paternity test on Cassie's pregnancy. He had done this, I suspected, because he was not entirely certain the child was his. And he had done this without telling Jennifer, because if the result was what he feared, he needed to know before she did. Raymond had a former law school colleague who now worked in medical malpractice, a field that required extensive familiarity with the evidentiary chain of custody for clinical test results. Through a process that was considerably more procedurally careful than a simple phone call, and that I will not detail here because the specifics are less important than the outcome, we had obtained confirmation of what the clinic's test had found. The pregnancy was not Ethan's. The biological father was a man named Tyler Brooks, Ethan's personal trainer, a 31-year-old former collegiate swimmer who had been employed by Ethan 18 months ago, who trained both of them 3 mornings a week, and who had apparently been considerably more present in Cassie's life than Ethan had realized. Cassie knew. She had been the one to request the secondary comparison analysis. She'd submitted Tyler's DNA profile for comparison herself, from a sample she'd provided under the guise of routine prenatal genetic screening, which meant Cassie had sat in a hotel room somewhere and made a decision. The test result was a problem she would manage, and the way she would manage it was by making sure the pregnancy became publicly established as Ethan's before anyone could question it. She had not counted on the fact that Ethan had obtained the same test independently and had been sitting on the result for 2 weeks, uncertain what to do with it. She had not counted on me. I had prepared the file carefully. The test documentation, the chain of custody records, a legal certification obtained through Raymond's office confirming the authenticity of the results, and, most importantly, a brief prepared by Raymond outlining the legal principle that once a person voluntarily discloses information about a pregnancy on a live national broadcast, that pregnancy becomes a matter of public record, removing the standard medical privacy protections that would otherwise apply. I had sent this file to Andrea Bloom's producer at 7:45 that morning, 15 minutes before the broadcast began, with a cover note explaining the documentation and a single condition. The file was to be disclosed on air only if and when Cassie Voss made a public statement about her pregnancy. At 8:11 a.m., Cassie placed her hand on her stomach and told the country she was expecting Ethan Powell's child. At 8:12 a.m., I pressed send on the follow-up confirmation email to the producer. At 8:13 a.m., I watched Andrea Bloom's hand go to her ear. What happened next took 4 minutes and 37 seconds of airtime. I know because I timed it. Andrea Bloom's professional composure was one of the things that made her good at her job. She could receive information in her earpiece and continue a sentence without any visible interruption, like a pilot receiving a rerouting instruction at altitude and adjusting course without spilling anyone's coffee. But this information was not a rerouting. This was a complete change in weather. She looked at her tablet, she looked at Cassie, and then she did what any journalist with 30 years of experience and a genuine nose for a story would do. She asked the question, "Cassie, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to something that's just been provided to our team by a verified source. This is documentation from a licensed clinical laboratory in New Jersey dated 6 weeks ago." She set the tablet flat on the desk where both guests could see it. It's a prenatal paternity test. The patient listed is you, and according to the certified results, she paused in the way that experienced television journalists pause when they know every second of silence is doing work. Ethan Powell is excluded as the biological father. The studio went quiet in the way that studios only go quiet when something has happened that no one prepared for. Cassie's face. I watched it carefully because I had been watching her face for months and I knew its particular grammar. Went through a sequence that lasted less than 2 seconds. Calculation, the search for a viable denial, and then the particular collapse that happens when you understand that there is no viable denial available. "That is private medical information," she said. Her voice had lost its warmth completely. "You cannot show that on—" "You disclosed your pregnancy on a live national broadcast 30 seconds ago," Andrea said, not unkindly but without any softness either, "which makes it a matter of public record. I want to be fair to you. Is there anything in this documentation that you believe is inaccurate?" Cassie looked off camera. Jennifer and her PR team were back there somewhere, behind the lights, and Cassie was looking for instruction the way a person looks for a lifeline when they're already in the water. No instruction came fast enough. Ethan turned and looked at Cassie, and the thing that happened in his face, I am not a person who takes satisfaction in watching people realize the scale of their own mistakes, but I watched this one because it was going to be entered into the legal record anyway, and because I am an actuary and I understand that sometimes the data is uncomfortable. And the thing that happened in his face was the specific collapse of a man who had been holding a secret for 2 weeks and just watched it explode in a direction he hadn't predicted. The secondary comparison, Andrea continued, reading from the tablet with the careful precision of someone who understands they are now in the center of a story that will be replayed for years, names the biological father as Tyler Brooks, currently employed as a personal fitness trainer. Ethan stood up. He was wearing a live microphone. What followed in the 41 seconds before the network cut to commercial was inadmissible in some courts and completely admissible in others, and most relevantly, constituted under New York State family law and the infidelity clause in the Powell Family Trust, a publicly recorded, voluntarily made, unambiguous confession of marital infidelity. Every word he said to Cassie in those 41 seconds was broadcast to the 11 million people watching that morning. Every word was recorded. Every word went into Raymond's evidence file within the hour. I sat at the dining table in Brooklyn and watched the commercial break begin, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the clean, quiet satisfaction of a calculation that has returned the expected result. I picked up my phone and called Raymond. "Did you record it?" I said. "Every second," he said. "The infidelity clause is triggered. Under the trust instrument, Ethan's documented marital infidelity transfers his proxy rights over his minor children's trust shares to their primary legal guardian." A pause. "That's you." "That's 15%, I said. "That's 15%, he confirmed. I looked at the spreadsheet open on my laptop, the one I'd been building for 3 days. 15% was the beginning. Jennifer Powell did not call me. She did not reach out to Raymond. She did not, as far as I could determine, spend any meaningful time processing what had happened on live television that Saturday morning. She spent the weekend planning. I learned this the way I learned most things about Jennifer's movements during those days, through the small, observable data points that aggregate into a picture when you're paying attention. Her car made 3 trips on Saturday. One to a building on the Upper East Side where a Dr. Franklin Oakes maintained a private medical practice. One to her attorney's office. One back home. Dr. Franklin Oakes was 63 years old and had been the medical director of a hospital where Jennifer sat on the donor board for 11 years. He was a competent clinician who had made a series of poor decisions in his personal life, specifically a gambling problem that had accrued over 4 years into a debt of considerable size, a debt that Jennifer had quietly retired 18 months ago in exchange for what had been described at the time as an ongoing consulting relationship. The consulting relationship had not, until now, required him to do anything. On Saturday, it required him to do something. Raymond received the notification on Monday morning. Jennifer's attorneys had filed an emergency motion in New York State Family Court, supported by a medical affidavit signed by Dr. Franklin Oakes, claiming that Ethan Powell had a documented history of severe male infertility, a 0% probability of biological fatherhood, and that the children Margot had delivered were therefore the product of an anonymous sperm donor, holding no biological claim to the Powell Family Trust. Raymond called me as I was feeding the boys. "She filed through the court," he said, "not through the family council. She went to the court first." "Of course she did," I said. "She wants a judicial determination before the council meeting. She thinks a court order will force the council to accept her framing. The court will appoint an independent medical expert to evaluate the affidavit." "Yes," I said, "it will." I had been waiting for this. 3 days before I went into labor, 3 days before any of this began, I had sat in the office of my obstetrician, Dr. Sarah Anand, and I had asked her a question. The question was this: in cases where the paternity of a newborn might later be disputed through legal proceedings, what was the most legally defensible way to establish a documented, certified, independently verifiable genetic record at the time of birth? Dr. Annan was a practical woman who had been delivering babies in New York for 22 years and had seen most of the ways that human situations could become complicated. She had not asked me why I was asking. She had simply answered the question. The answer was a voluntary DNA collection at the time of birth, overseen by a licensed notary public and processed by an independent CLIA-certified laboratory, with a full chain of custody documentation filed with both the laboratory and a third-party legal depository. I had done this. 2 hours after my boys were born, while Jennifer was still unaware that I'd given birth, I had not called Ethan until my sons were 4 hours old, because the first 4 hours were mine. Dr. Anand had collected the DNA samples. The notary public Raymond had arranged was in the waiting room. The samples had gone to a laboratory in New Jersey with no connection to any Powell-affiliated institution. The results were in a sealed envelope in Raymond's office safe. When the court appointed its independent medical expert and requested DNA verification, Raymond submitted the envelope through proper evidentiary channels. The chain of custody was unimpeachable. The results were unambiguous. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Ethan Powell is the confirmed biological father of both male infants. Dr. Franklin Oakes was summoned to explain the discrepancy between his affidavit and the court's independent finding. Under oath, facing the specific and detailed questions of a family court judge who had not been doing this job for 18 years by being easy to mislead, Dr. Oakes did what people do when the alternative is perjury on top of fraud. He told the truth. Jennifer had asked him to prepare false documentation. He had done so because of the financial obligation he felt he owed her. He was deeply sorry. He understood the gravity of what he had done. The court referred the matter to the state medical board and the district attorney's office. Jennifer received a formal notice that she was under investigation for suborning fraud upon the court. I was in Raymond's office when he called to tell me. I wrote down the number 15% on a legal pad, circled it, and drew an arrow pointing right. Then I opened my laptop and looked at the stock market. Powell Logistics had opened Monday morning down 11%. By Wednesday, following the Saturday broadcast and the subsequent news cycle that had methodically distributed every detail of the studio scene to every platform that distributed anything, it was down 23% from its pre-crisis level. This was not, by historical standards, an unusual market response to an executive family scandal of this magnitude. Institutional investors who held logistics sector equities were not sentimental. They had risk models. The models flagged senior leadership credibility collapse and pending regulatory investigation as material adverse conditions, and the models responded accordingly. I watched the stock price with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific number. On Wednesday afternoon, it hit that number. I called Raymond. "Start buying," I said. Here I need to explain something about how this worked, because the original version of this story, the version I've heard people tell when they get the facts somewhat garbled, makes it sound like I bought 36% of a major company in 48 hours, which is not how securities markets function and is not what happened. What actually happened was this. Raymond's firm had established 4 separate limited liability companies in Delaware over the previous 8 weeks. A standard corporate structure tool with entirely legitimate uses, including the aggregation of investment capital from multiple sources. These entities began purchasing Powell Logistics shares on the open market on Wednesday afternoon. Under the Williams Act, any entity that accumulates more than 5% of a publicly traded company's shares is required to file a Schedule 13D disclosure with the SEC. We filed our first 13D on Thursday morning when the combined holdings crossed the 5% threshold. This was public. This was visible to anyone who looked at SEC filings, which Jennifer's attorneys should have been looking at and apparently weren't, because Jennifer was occupied with the family court investigation and had decided the stock market was a secondary concern. We continued buying on Thursday and Friday, updating the 13D filing each time a material change in holdings occurred, exactly as required by law. By Friday afternoon, 9 days after I had walked out of that hospital, the 4 entities collectively held 28% of Powell Logistics' outstanding public shares. Combined with the 15% proxy I held through the infidelity clause, 43%. Not enough. But I had known it wouldn't be enough. I had planned for that. Diana had been quiet all week in the way that people are quiet when they are thinking about something significant. On Friday evening, she sat down across from me at the dining table after the boys were asleep and Raymond was in the other room on a call. She had a glass of wine. She put it down without drinking from it and looked at me directly. "I have 8%, she said. I had known this. The 8% was in Raymond's analysis of the Powell trust structure, an inheritance from Gerald Powell Sr. that had been transferred to Diana directly, in her personal name, before Jennifer had understood the implications of that transfer. Jennifer had spent years trying to claw it back through various legal mechanisms and had failed, because Gerald Sr.'s attorneys had been careful people and the transfer was ironclad. "I know," I said. If I vote with you, 43 plus 8, I said. 51%. Diana picked up her wine glass. She held it without drinking. I want you to understand that I'm not doing this for the money, she said. I'm not doing this because of my inheritance or because I want a role in the company or because I want to win some family argument that's been going on since before you were part of this family. She looked at me. I'm doing it because she walked into your hospital room 3 days after you gave birth and put a price on your children. And I was raised by that woman, and I spent a long time excusing the things she did because she's my mother, and I am done excusing them. I held her gaze. I know, I said. That's why I didn't ask. She nodded once, then she drank her wine. The next morning, Diana Powell Hartley filed a formal shareholder notification with Powell Logistics corporate secretary indicating her intention to vote her 8% stake in the upcoming emergency board meeting. 43% plus 8%. 51. I was the majority shareholder of Powell Logistics. There is a moment in any sufficiently complex calculation when all the variables resolve, not gradually, not incrementally, all at once. The way a fog lifts, the way a fracture becomes visible under the right light. One moment you are looking at a system of interacting uncertainties, and the next moment you are looking at the answer. I had been waiting for that moment for 9 days. It arrived on a Friday morning in February at 8 o'clock on the 42nd floor of the Powell Logistics Tower in Midtown Manhattan. I want to tell you what I wore because it matters in the way that small, deliberate choices matter when you are walking into a room where people have already decided what you are. I wore a white suit, not ivory, not cream, white. The color of hospital beds and blank contracts and new documents waiting to be written. I had bought it 6 weeks before my sons were born, in a size that accounted for the fact that I would be postpartum, because I am an actuary and I account for things. I wore flat shoes because I had a surgical incision that was 11 days old, and I was not going to compromise my stability for aesthetic effect. I pushed a double stroller because my sons were 11 days old and I was not leaving them anywhere. Raymond walked beside me. He was carrying his briefcase and wearing the particular expression of a man who has reviewed every document in that briefcase multiple times and is confident in every page. Diana met us at the elevator bank. She had dressed carefully too. Not in the understated way she usually dressed, the way of someone who has spent years trying not to draw attention, but in the deliberate way of someone who has decided that today she is going to take up exactly the space she is entitled to. The three of us walked into the boardroom at 8:02 a.m. The room was already full. Powell Logistics Board of Directors consisted of 9 members, 7 of whom were present. They were, as a group, the kind of men who had made their careers in an era when the relevant question in any business meeting was not what does the data say, but who has the longest relationship with whom. They were not unintelligent, but they were accustomed to a particular kind of power, and that particular kind of power was sitting at the head of the table in a red suit, and they were oriented toward it the way plants orient toward light. Jennifer had arrived first. Of course she had. She was standing at the head of the long mahogany table with a leather portfolio and the composed authority of a woman who has decided that the best response to catastrophe is to act as though it hasn't happened. Ethan was seated to her left. He looked, in the flat light of the boardroom, like a man who had aged several years in the past week. The careful composure he'd performed on television Saturday morning was gone. What remained was something more honest and considerably less useful. A man who understood that he had made a series of terrible decisions and was waiting to find out how terrible they actually were. He saw me walk in. He looked at the stroller. He looked at me. He looked away. Jennifer did not look away. She watched me cross the room with the focused attention of a predator tracking movement, calculating distance, assessing threat. She had known I was coming. Raymond had filed the required notification of shareholder attendance. But knowing and seeing are different experiences, and for a fraction of a second I saw something move behind her composure. Then it was gone, and she was speaking. This emergency session has been called to address an unprecedented disruption to Powell Logistics' operational leadership and public standing, she said, projecting to the room with the ease of someone who has run meetings for 30 years. Before we proceed to business, I want to acknowledge that there is an unauthorized individual present with no standing to participate in these proceedings. I'll ask security to... Mrs. Powell. Raymond set his briefcase on the table and opened it with a sound that cut cleanly through her sentence. He produced a document bearing a court seal and held it up for the room. Your daughter-in-law is present as the duly authorized representative of a 51% majority shareholder position in Powell Logistics. She has every legal right to be in this room. Any attempt to remove her or her legal counsel will constitute interference with shareholder rights, which is a matter I am prepared to address in federal court before this meeting concludes. He set the document on the table. I'd suggest we proceed. The security guard who had taken a step forward took a step back. Jennifer looked at Raymond with an expression that people who have known her for a long time probably recognized as the precursor to something significant. Then she looked at me. "Sit down, Margot," she said. The temperature in her voice had dropped past cold into something that had no name in the weather vocabulary. "And let's hear whatever performance you've arranged." I locked the stroller wheels. I sat down, not at the side of the table, at the opposite end from Jennifer. She went first, because she had called the meeting and because she was Jennifer Powell and she believed, still, at this point, that the situation was recoverable. I will give her this. She was extraordinary at it. She laid out the week's events in a framework that would have been genuinely persuasive to anyone who didn't have access to the underlying documents. She acknowledged the television incident, a deeply unfortunate family crisis that has been exploited by a hostile party, and moved quickly past it. She presented the board with a restructuring proposal that consolidated executive authority, proposed an interim leadership structure to stabilize investor confidence, and addressed the stock decline with a projected recovery timeline based on comparable industry scenarios. She was composed, she was specific, she had clearly been working on this presentation since Saturday. The board members were listening with the focused attention of men who were watching their net worth recover or continue to decline depending on what happened in the next hour. Then she opened her portfolio and produced copies of Dr. Oakes' medical affidavit, the one he had already recanted under oath in family court. Regarding the question of legitimate heirs, she said, distributing the copies with the calm efficiency of someone who has decided to present false information as true and has made her peace with that decision. I want to draw the board's attention to a medical assessment prepared by Dr. Franklin Oakes, a respected clinician with 20 years of Jennifer. Raymond's voice was quiet. The quietness was the kind that rooms respond to. Dr. Oakes recanted that affidavit under oath in family court on Wednesday. He has subsequently been referred to the State Medical Board for professional review and to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud upon the court. Raymond reached into his briefcase and produced the court transcript. Would you like me to read the relevant section aloud, or would you prefer the board members to review it themselves? The murmuring that went around the table was not the murmuring of men who were surprised exactly. It was the murmuring of men who had suspected something was wrong and were now watching the confirmation arrive. Jennifer did not flinch. I had expected she wouldn't. She had known before she walked into this room that the Oakes affidavit was a liability. She had brought it anyway because she needed the board to hear her narrative before they heard mine, and she had calculated that even a challenge document created useful confusion. The paternity question will be resolved through the appropriate legal channels, she said smoothly, pivoting. What I'm asking the board to consider today is the operational stability of this company, which requires the paternity question has already been resolved, I said. It was the first time I had spoken since sitting down. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. I reached into the bag hanging from the stroller handle, not a briefcase, a diaper bag, which I had chosen deliberately because I wanted every person in this room to understand exactly what they were dealing with. And I produced a sealed envelope bearing the certification stamp of a CLIA licensed independent laboratory and the notarial seal of a New York State licensed notary public. I set it on the table. This DNA analysis was collected 2 hours after my sons were born, I said, under the supervision of my obstetrician and a notary public with full chain of custody documentation. It was processed by a laboratory with no affiliation to Powell Logistics or any related entity. The results have been filed with the family court as Exhibit A in the paternity proceeding. I looked at the board member nearest the envelope, a 67-year-old man named Stewart, who had been on this board for 14 years and who I had assessed as the most procedurally careful member of the group. Would you open it and read the conclusion on page 3? Stewart looked at Jennifer. Jennifer's expression told him nothing useful. He picked up the envelope, broke the seal, found page 3, and read. Probability of paternity, he said, and his voice had the specific quality of a man who is reading something he would rather not have to read aloud. 99.97%. Ethan Powell is confirmed as the biological father of both male subjects. The murmuring change a register. Ethan put his face in his hands. Jennifer set down her pen. The paternity is established, Raymond said, moving forward before the room could resettle around that information. Which means the grandfather clause condition has been met. Ethan Powell has produced biological heirs before his 35th birthday. The heirs have not been recognized by the family council, Jennifer said. Her voice was still controlled. She was still fighting. I had expected she would be. Under the trust instrument, recognition requires a formal council determination. As chair of the council, as a member of the council, Diana said. Everyone looked at her. Diana had not spoken since entering the room. She was sitting 4 seats down from Jennifer, and she was looking at her mother with an expression that was entirely clear and entirely final. The expression of someone who made a decision weeks ago and is now simply executing it. I am a member of the Powell Family Council, Diana said. I hold one of 3 votes. And I am formally recording my vote here in front of the board to recognize Ethan Powell's biological sons as legitimate heirs under the terms of the family trust. She paused. That's 2 of 3 council votes. The recognition passes regardless of how the chair votes. Jennifer looked at her daughter. Something happened in her face that I had never seen there before. I won't describe it as grief, because I don't know what Jennifer Powell feels or has ever felt, and I'm not in the business of narrating other people's interior lives. But something moved across her features that was different from anything I'd seen in 5 years of watching her. Something that had no strategy in it. Then it was gone. You have recognition, she said. Her voice was very flat. The heirs are recognized. The grandfather clause is satisfied. Ethan retains his inheritance position. She looked at the board. Which means this company continues to operate under its established leadership structure with me as Jennifer. I spoke quietly. We haven't gotten to the shareholder vote yet. Raymond distributed the updated shareholder registry, the version filed with the SEC at 7 o'clock that morning, to every board member simultaneously. He was efficient about it. He had the kind of efficiency that comes from having done the preparation work so thoroughly that the execution is simply motion. The board members opened their copies. Stuart turned to page 4. I watched his eyes move down the column of numbers. I watched the moment he understood what he was reading. These entities, he said slowly. These Delaware LLCs. They've been accumulating shares since Wednesday of this week, Raymond said. All acquisitions were made on the open market at prevailing market prices. All required Schedule 13D disclosures were filed with the SEC at the legally mandated intervals. Every transaction is fully documented and entirely above board. He paused. The 4 entities collectively hold 28% of Powell Logistics' outstanding public shares. Who owns these entities? Stuart asked. He was looking at me when he asked it. He already knew. I do, I said. The room did what rooms do when a number lands in them that changes the meaning of every other number. It went very still. Jennifer picked up the registry. I watched her find the column. I watched her add the numbers. She was fast at it. I had always known she was fast at this kind of math. It was one of the things I'd had to account for. 28% public shares, 15% proxy from the infidelity clause, Diana's 8%, 51. You don't have a majority, Jennifer said, but her voice, for the first time, had something uncertain in it. She was saying the words while simultaneously running the numbers, and the numbers were not resolving the way she needed them to. 28 plus 15 plus 8, I said. 51%. I looked at her steadily. I'm the majority shareholder, Jennifer. The stillness in the room cracked. 2 board members started talking simultaneously. Stuart held up his hand for quiet and got it, because he was the kind of man whose requests for quiet were honored even without authority behind them. The shares were purchased during an active stock decline using capital that... Jennifer stopped. She had almost asked where I'd gotten the capital. She had stopped herself because she had, in that moment, understood the answer. $18 million. Her $18 million. Or rather, and this was the part she would have to live with, the pension fund's $18 million, which she had moved to her personal account and used to try to buy my silence, and which had instead funded the acquisition of her company. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and looked at me, and in that look was something I hadn't anticipated. Not rage, not calculation, but a kind of stark and genuine recognition. The look of a chess player who has just seen, retroactively, the sequence of moves that led to checkmate. "The pension fund," she said quietly. "Yes," I said. It was the only word either of us said about it in that room. The vote was procedurally straightforward. As majority shareholder, I had the authority to call for a board resolution on executive leadership. Raymond outlined the legal basis. Stewart seconded the motion before Raymond had finished the sentence, which told me everything I needed to know about how the board had been feeling about Jennifer Powell before I walked into the room. The resolution: immediate termination of Jennifer Powell and Ethan Powell from all executive and board level positions within Powell Logistics, with cause, effective upon conclusion of the meeting. No severance, no transition period. Cause being documented in the formal record as subornation of fraud upon the court, attempted manipulation of the shareholder registry through forged medical documentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. 7 votes in favor, 0 against, 2 abstentions, both of whom were men who had known Jennifer for 20 years and couldn't quite bring themselves to raise their hands against her, but couldn't bring themselves to vote for her either. Ethan did not vote. He was no longer a board member. The resolution passed. Jennifer picked up her portfolio. She stood up. She walked to the door with the posture she had walked into rooms with for 60 years, the posture of a woman who believes a room belongs to her. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. "You'll run this company into the ground within a year," she said. "Probably," I said, "which is why I'm selling it." She turned then, just slightly, just enough that I could see her profile. Then she walked out. I found her in her office on the 54th floor 20 minutes later. She was standing at the window when I came in. Not packing, not shredding, just standing. Looking out at Manhattan, the way you look at something you've decided you're seeing for the last time. I closed the door behind me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city spread out below us in the particular gray clarity of a winter morning, very bright and very cold, the buildings throwing long shadows across one another. "When did you start planning?" she asked. She didn't turn from the window. "When I found the audit discrepancy," I said, 6 weeks before I delivered. That's when I knew what you were capable of." I paused. "But I didn't start planning to do this. I started planning to leave safely. This," I gestured at the room, the building, the morning. "This only became possible because of the choices you made." "I underestimated you." "You underestimated what I do for a living," I said. "You thought being an actuary meant I was good with numbers. It means I understand systems, how they hold together and where they fail." I crossed the room and stood a few feet from her. "Your system failed at the same place these systems always fail. You believed your money made you invulnerable. It made you careless." She was quiet for a long time. "The pension fund," she said again. Not a question this time. "I have the full documentation," I said. "The routing records, the transfer authorizations, the offshore account trail. Raymond has compiled it into a package that is ready to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office." I let that sit for a moment. "I'm not sending it, not if you do 2 things. She finally turned from the window. "The first thing," I said, "is that you sign a civil repayment agreement today. Structured payments from your personal assets back to the Powell Logistics Pension Fund over a period that your remaining liquidity can actually support. Not a token amount, full restitution with a court-enforceable schedule." "And the second thing, you leave," I said, "completely. No contact with me, no contact with my sons, no interference with the company's transition, no communication with board members or investors intended to undermine the sale process. You walk away from all of it, and you stay away." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read and didn't try to. "And if I do these 2 things," she said, "you don't send the file. I don't send the file." She was quiet for a very long time, long enough that I could hear the city through the glass, the low, continuous sound of a place that does not pause for anyone's particular crisis. "You could have destroyed me completely," she said finally. "The federal charges, I know." "Why didn't you?" I thought about how to answer this honestly, because destroying you completely would have required years of litigation and depositions and news cycles, I said, "and I have 2 11-day-old sons and a company to sell and a practice to rebuild. I don't have time to destroy you." I paused. and because the 2,047 people in your pension fund need their money back. That matters more to me than what happens to you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she walked to her desk. She opened the top drawer and removed her corporate keycard, her building access fob, and a set of keys I recognized as belonging to the company car. She set them on the desk in a neat row. She picked up her personal bag, not the leather portfolio, not the corporate documents, just a small personal bag that she'd carried into this office every morning for a decade. She walked to the door. "Margot," she said. I waited. "You're better at this than I was," she said, "for whatever that's worth." She left. I stood in the empty office for a while, looking at the keys on the desk. Then I called Harrison Caldwell. Harrison Caldwell was the CEO of Vanguard Global Shipping, Powell Logistics' largest competitor and the company that had been trying to break into Powell's market share for the better part of a decade. He was 60 years old, and he had the directness of someone who had long ago stopped seeing any benefit in indirection. "I've been watching your stock ticker all week," he said when I introduced myself. "I assume you're calling to discuss the obvious." "I'm calling because I'm the majority shareholder of Powell Logistics, and I'd like to discuss a sale," I said. "But I'm not selling at the distressed price. I'm selling at the 90-day trailing average from before the scandal, the price that reflects what this company actually is, independent of the family drama that drove the decline." A pause. "That's a significant premium over current market price." "It's a fair price for a company with Powell's shipping infrastructure, port contracts, and route network," I said. "You've wanted this market position for 10 years. I'm offering it to you at a price that will look cheap in 2 years." "And if I say no?" "Then I stabilize the company, the stock recovers over the next 6 months, and you pay more for it then," I said. "Or a European conglomerate that's been watching the situation pays it instead. I have another call scheduled for this afternoon." There was a longer pause. "Send me the valuation documentation," Harrison said. "I'll have my team review it over the weekend." "You have until Monday," I said. "After that, the other call happens." He called back on Sunday. The deal took 3 weeks to finalize. 3 weeks of lawyers and due diligence and regulatory filings and all the ordinary machinery of a large commercial transaction. It was not exciting. It was thorough and careful and exactly what it needed to be. On the day the sale closed, I signed the final documents at a conference table in a law firm's offices, with Raymond beside me and a very good cup of coffee in front of me, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a transaction that had been executed correctly. The proceeds landed in my account the following morning. I did not look at the number for very long. I am an actuary. I understand that a number is only as meaningful as what you do with it. What I did, I established a protected educational trust for my sons, separate from, and in addition to, the one Jennifer had inadvertently funded. I funded it in full. I arranged for a portion of the proceeds to be donated to a nonprofit organization that provided legal support to women navigating custody disputes without financial resources. Anonymously. That part was not for anyone else to know. I gave Raymond a check that was considerably larger than his legal fee. He tried to give it back. I explained that it wasn't a fee. It was seed capital for the independent practice he'd been talking about starting for 3 years. He stopped trying to give it back. I kept enough for a house, a rebuilt practice, and the freedom to choose my clients and my hours and my life. The rest I invested, conservatively, with a long time horizon. I am an actuary. We plan for the long run. The leaves on the trees outside Diana and Raymond's brownstone had turned amber and deep red, the particular colors of a New York autumn that manages to be beautiful despite everything the city does to make beauty difficult. It was Thanksgiving. Diana had been cooking since 10 in the morning with the focused energy of someone who had decided that this meal was going to be good and was not going to let the turkey's opinion on the matter interfere with that. Raymond had been assigned to the potatoes and had been asking for supervision at 20-minute intervals, which Diana was providing with the combination of patience and affectionate exasperation that characterized their marriage in general. I was sitting on the living room floor with my sons. They were 8 months old now. They had opinions, strong ones frequently expressed. The older of the two, older by 4 minutes, a distinction he seemed determined to leverage in ways that were impressive for someone without object permanence, was currently engaged in a systematic effort to remove every wooden block from the basket Diana had filled for them and examine each one individually before rejecting it and moving to the next. His brother was watching this process with the focused attention of a researcher observing an experiment he intends to replicate. I watched them and I thought about the night in that hospital room when I had looked at them in the bassinet for the first time, 2 small facts I couldn't argue with, and made them a promise I hadn't said out loud. I had kept it. The apartment smelled like roasting turkey and the candles Diana had lit on the mantelpiece and something Raymond had put in the potatoes that was either going to be excellent or a disaster. The radiator made its periodic ticking sound. Through the window, I could hear the street, not the urgent, pressured sound of Midtown, but the particular sound of a Brooklyn neighborhood in late afternoon, which is a more human sound and one I had grown genuinely fond of. I had found an apartment 12 blocks from here in September. It had a small backyard where I intended to grow things in the spring, which I had never done before and was approaching with the same research-intensive preparation I brought to everything. I had a home office where I saw clients via video call on my own schedule, working the hours I chose to work and declining the engagements I chose to decline. I had a pediatrician I liked and a good coffee place 2 blocks away and a life that was, by every meaningful measure, mine. Diana came in from the kitchen and sat on the floor beside me with a glass of wine. She picked up one of the rejected wooden blocks and handed it to the older twin, who examined it, found it acceptable this time, and held it with the satisfaction of someone who has finally located the correct data point. "Have you heard anything?" she asked. She didn't specify what she meant. She didn't need to. "Not directly," I said. "Raymond told me Jennifer's repayment schedule is current. She's meeting the installments." "And Ethan?" "He's working." I paused. "He reached out last month. Through Raymond, not directly. He wanted to know if he could meet the boys." Diana looked at me. "What did you say?" I said not yet. I watched my son set the wooden block down very carefully with enormous deliberateness and then look up at me with an expression of complete satisfaction. "Maybe eventually they'll have the right to know where they come from, but that's a decision for later when I understand better what he's actually changed and what he's only performed changing. I'm not in a hurry." "That's fair," Diana said. "I'm an actuary," I said. "I take the long view." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that means something. Raymond appeared in the doorway. He was wearing an apron and an expression of moderate concern. "The potatoes are fine," he said to no one in particular. "I want that on the record." "The potatoes are always fine," Diana said. "They are definitively fine," he said. "I'm just noting it officially." He disappeared back into the kitchen. Diana refilled her wine. The older twin had moved on from the blocks and was now studying his own hand with the expression of someone encountering genuinely startling new data. I thought about Jennifer Powell, alone in whatever smaller life she was living now, not out of satisfaction, but in the way you think about a variable that has been removed from an equation. The equation was simpler without her in it, cleaner. The answer was easier to read. I thought about what she had said in her office at the window. "You're better at this than I was." I had thought about that sentence a number of times in the months since. I understood what she meant by it. She meant the financial maneuvering, the corporate strategy, the execution under pressure. She was wrong about that being the thing that mattered. What I was better at, the thing that had actually made the difference, was simpler than any of the transactions, any of the legal filings, any of the calculations I'd run in those 9 days. I had understood what I was actually trying to protect. Jennifer spent 60 years protecting her power. She confused the power for the thing that mattered and lost both. I had never been confused about what I was protecting. I had 2 facts I couldn't argue with, sleeping in a bassinet 3 days after they were born, and everything I did afterward had been in service of getting them safely to a Tuesday morning in autumn with wooden blocks and an amber light coming through the window. The equation had been simple all along. I just had to be patient enough to let it resolve. Raymond called us to the table at 5 o'clock. It was not an elaborate table. Diana had put out the good dishes, but there were only 4 place settings, and the centerpiece was a small arrangement of autumn leaves she'd gathered from the street that morning and put in a mason jar, which was the kind of thing Diana did, finding the beautiful version of the ordinary thing. Raymond carved the turkey with great ceremony and moderate competence. Diana had made 3 side dishes and a pie. The boys sat in their high chairs at the end of the table and managed between them to distribute a significant quantity of sweet potato across a surprisingly large surface area. Raymond raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to the most methodical act of self-defense I have ever witnessed in 20 years of practicing law." Diana raised her glass. I raised mine. "To the people who show up," Diana said, "even when it's complicated." We ate. The turkey was good. The potatoes were, as Raymond had predicted, fine. The pie was excellent. The boys fell asleep before dessert, which meant I ate mine in the particular tranquil silence of a table where small children have recently been present and are now, briefly, not. Outside, the last light of the November afternoon faded from amber to gray to the particular blue of an early evening in the city. Inside, the candles burned. The radiator ticked. Someone laughed at something Raymond said. I held my wine glass and listened to the sounds of a life that was, finally, exactly the size and shape I needed it to be. Jennifer Powell had thought $18 million was the price of my children. She had not understood, she had never understood, which was perhaps the central fact of her character, that there are things that don't have a price, not because they are priceless in the romantic sense, but because no transaction can transfer them. They aren't held by having. They aren't lost by losing. I had not needed to buy my sons back. I had only needed to make sure that no one could take them. The math had taken care of the rest. Thank you for staying with me through Margot's story. If you've been with me from the beginning, from that hospital room on a Wednesday night in February, then you know that this was never really a story about money or corporate strategy or a hostile takeover. It was a story about knowing what you're protecting and refusing to stop protecting it. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it gave you even a small piece of strength for something you're facing in your own life, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support is what allows me to keep bringing these stories to you. I'll see you in the next one.